Hello, I'm Femi OK, and you're in the stream. Today, why are some calling New Zealand the world's newest surveillance state? We'll discuss the country's new domestic spying law. Our digital producer Malika Bilal is here looking out for your live feedback. Malika, hello.
Hey, Femi.
I have to say hello to New Zealand. Hello, New Zealand. Never been able to say that before.
Never.
So this is the first time we've done a New Zealand program. How do you think it might influence the kind of tweets, the online community response that we're going to get?
Well, it is 7:30 in the morning there,
Right.
so we'll see. But we already got a lot of interaction overnight from New Zealanders, so I'm excited to bring it in. Now, some New Zealanders were asking and were concerned that this had made international news, weren't surprised that it had. But on Facebook, one commenter explained it. He says, this is a case not just for New Zealanders, it's a case for the entire global village. Thanks for that comment, Asset. And of course, for those of you at home, we want to get your conversation into this global conversation. So join it with the hashtag AJStream.
Now, before we get into today's main conversation, here's a look at what the stream is following on Twitter. A surveillance state, that's what some critics are calling New Zealand in response to a new law that allows the government to spy on its citizens. Prime Minister John Key and his supporters say that the law regarding the Government Communications Security Bureau, or GCSB, is an improvement and creates a legal framework of checks and balances for the type of surveillance necessary to protect national security. Meanwhile, opponents say they don't want the government reading their email, phone logs and other communications. Many also just fear government abuse. So, what impact will domestic spying have on privacy for New Zealanders? To help us discuss this, we have James Veitch. He's an international security analyst who supports the new legislation. He joins us from Wellington. And in Auckland, Dennis O'Rourke is a member of Parliament from the New Zealand First Party, which is calling for even greater oversight of domestic spying. And via Skype in Kuala Lumpur, Oliver Woods. He's a founder of an anti-GCSB online campaign called Cross the Floor. So, Oliver, Dennis and James, hello. It's great to have you all in the stream. Let me start with Oliver.
Yeah.
Now that this new law is a law, what can the New Zealand government do to you in terms of surveillance?
I think that the major change is that this has been a dramatic increase in the power of the state to look into your private life. This GCSB bill and some of the legislation that's being passed around it really represents one of the largest extensions of the idea of a surveillance state into New Zealand life and culture. And I think it's a disaster. I think it's New Zealanders can expect something like a more modern version of Minority Report. And I'm really concerned about the legislation and the chilling effect it's going to have on democracy and freedom of speech in New Zealand.
Dennis, how chilled are you by the prospect of this law and what it's going to do to you as a New Zealand private citizen?
Yes, I am concerned that, in fact, there isn't enough oversight on the powers of ministers in New Zealand, especially the Prime Minister, to authorise spying on New Zealanders. And there isn't enough restriction on ministerial discretion as to where the information may go, or indeed whether spying is justified on any New Zealand citizen. So those are the main areas which I would be concerned about. Of course, there's always been a law in New Zealand which permitted, with authorisation or a warrant, spying on New Zealand residents. What we see now is an expansion of those laws, and that's a concern to us in the New Zealand First Party.
Well, Jim, I want to bring you in here. Now, we heard Oliver say that the GCSB was a disaster. Dennis said there's not enough oversight. On Twitter, people are saying similar things. Peter says this won't be the first or the last of its kind. If people have nothing to hide, there should be no problem. But Tory says, if you have nothing to hide, assumes a government with your best interests at heart. Does the New Zealand government have its citizens' best interests at heart?
Well, first of all, the bill or the law that's now come into effect has done nothing more than just regularise what's been happening for some time. The GCSB has been involved in helping the other agencies that it's linked with, the Security Intelligence Service and particularly the New Zealand Police, in doing jobs that they themselves have not been able to do, or else they've asked GCSB to help so that they can confirm the kind of things that they've been turning up themselves. So what's happening really is that the government has given GCSB officially the power that it's been exercising for some time. So I don't think we're going to see much change at all.
So Jim, what I'm hearing you saying, if you're regularising what's been happening for some time, so basically New Zealand government has been spying on its citizens for a while now, and what you're doing and what you're saying is you're just giving them a reality check to what's already been happening.
No, put it round the other way. The New Zealand Police are responsible in New Zealand for picking up anything that might be a threat to the state and a threat to New Zealand, sovereignty of New Zealand and so on. The police are responsible. They take cases against people, they charge people, but they often ask the Security Intelligence Service to help them, and they sometimes have been, from time to time, it hasn't been too often, they've asked GCSB to help to confirm what they themselves have turned up in terms of people plotting against the government or people making a fuss about things that cause the government or cause the police some concern. Now that's been going on for some years.
Jim, what I don't understand is that when I think of New Zealand, there are lots of things I think about New Zealand, all of them positive, all of them complimentary. I'm not thinking that you have enemies that you need to maybe be surveilling your own citizens for. What are we not seeing, and maybe what are people and the critics of GCSB not seeing about the dangers facing New Zealand?
Well, I think it's all been overdrawn a lot because New Zealand, as you say, New Zealand's a fairly benign sort of country, and we don't really get too hot and bothered about issues. But now and again there are people in our midst in New Zealand who do have concerns, and sometimes New Zealanders do get involved in conflicts overseas that cause some concern in New Zealand. But nothing has ever happened in New Zealand since 1985, since the Rainbow Warrior incident. Nothing has really happened in New Zealand to bring to attention the kind of issues that people are imagining will come out of this bill that's been passed into law.
Well, Oliver, Jim mentioned police. We have a video comment here left by a New Zealand citizen. I would like you to have a listen to this and let me know what you think.
Is domestic dragnet surveillance acceptable? In liberal democracies like New Zealand, there are many who say it is not. Is it acceptable where surveillance targets criminal elements? Yes, but there's an argument that suggests that these issues are best addressed by the police. What this government has done, however, is turn its external surveillance against its own people, and that is what is not popular here amongst the people in New Zealand.
So Oliver, one of the biggest issues of criticism one of the biggest issues of criticism that we're seeing here is that now New Zealand is spying on its own people.
Absolutely, and look, I mean
that's rubbish.
Very quickly, as a background on the GCSB, for the international audience out there, the GCSB was actually created as a spying agency to challenge New Zealand's external threats. It spied on recently declassified documents have shown it spied on Cuba, North Korea, Argentina, and the Soviet Union in the 1980s and 1990s. Now, I think what's so terrifying and why I'm so opposed to this GCSB legislation is we're seeing this organisation that was directed at external threats being directed at imaginary internal threats within. And I think that was a great video comment, whoever uploaded that, and that currently, prior to the GCSB, we already have a full legal framework to punish anyone doing the wrong thing in New Zealand. I don't understand why we need to direct an organisation full of spooks, full of spies, and direct it at well-meaning New Zealanders who have no guilt and have done nothing wrong in the first place.
Oliver, Jim just said what you said was rubbish. Jim?
Yeah, it is. GCSB is not being turned against New Zealand citizens. two things have happened in the law that's just passed. First of all, GCSB has been given official permission to maintain protection of New Zealand infrastructure. The GCSB has been given permission, in other words, to look after the financial structures of New Zealand and the knowledge structure of New Zealand, of all the New Zealand government agencies, plus the leading companies in New Zealand. Now, GCSB has the responsibility to break the firewall, to protect these companies from hackers and from viruses and so on.
Okay.
They were given that responsibility in 2011.
Okay.
And that means that if New Zealanders try to hack into New Zealand's own system, they'll get picked up by GCSB's activities. Now, that's the principal thing that the Act has given responsibility to GCSB for. That's official. It's been going since 2011. They don't have time to look at every New Zealander and spy on New Zealanders.
Jim, take a breath. Let me bring in Dennis. Dennis, go ahead.
Yes, it's been going illegally since that time, and it's not really true to say that this is just a regularisation. It does, in fact, create new powers which weren't there before, and that's one of the concerns. But I come back to the point that in New Zealand, it is only possible for government agencies to spy on New Zealanders if there is an authorisation or a warrant. So we must get that clear to begin with. Then the question becomes, what is the justification for a warrant or an authorisation to spy on New Zealanders? New Zealand First is very concerned that the legislation does not provide a robust regime to ensure that there is adequate justification, and that's at the core of the issue. The second issue for us is ministerial discretion, Prime Minister's discretion, about with whom the information collected can be shared. And thirdly, we have a major concern that there is inadequate oversight concerning ministers' discretions to give authorisations and warrants to spy on New Zealanders.
So Dennis, let me just ask you this.
Issues.
I want to really just get it back to grassroots because our audience are watching all over the world and really want to make sense of this. So I'm a New Zealand citizen. What can be done to me in terms of my private life and private affairs? Can you keep it simple for me?
Well, it is very
nothing
simple.
happens to you.
The GCSB legislation doesn't permit spying on New Zealanders unless it is authorised, and there has to be justification for that.
Right.
So that it can't be much simpler than this, and it is the questions around the justification and the oversight which are the core issues here.
Sure, and that's a political argument that I know that you're going to be waging in Parliament. Let me just bring in Malika again.
Well, it's interesting, you know, I mentioned that we were getting tweets from New Zealanders as we have on our show today, and one of them shows two sides to this story. Jesse Hawkswood tweets in, sadly, GCSB erodes civil liberties of Kiwis and calls into question why we have it in our relationship with certain major powers. But then he went on to leave a video comment. Jim, I'd like you to have a listen to this and let me know what you think.
A few Kiwis died in the Bali bombing, so I think it just helps to protect New Zealanders overseas, which is obviously a huge benefit to New Zealanders. And so, yeah, it's just kind of us playing our part.
Now, Jim, you'd mentioned that earlier in the show about New Zealand playing its part. You agree with the video comment?
Yes, I do. Yeah, New Zealand participates in what's known as the Five Eyes. That's the 5 intelligence organisations that was created, an organisation amongst countries that was created after the Second World War in last century. And these countries share intelligence between each other. And that's been important for New Zealand because it's been helps New Zealand and Australia talk to each other about things that are concerning to them in Southeast Asia, in Asia, and in other parts of the world where New Zealand and Australia have relationships. Now, GCSB plays a major role in that. It's not our only external organisation that collects stuff from overseas. Foreign Affairs does the same thing. All the embassies, every country that has embassies collects stuff from overseas. So all this stuff is collated back in New Zealand and written up and presented as policy or information to ministers of government, including the Prime Minister. So GCS plays, that's its major role, is really as an external collector of information which it shares with the other members of the Five Eyes.
So Jim just mentioned the Prime Minister John Key, he's Prime Minister of New Zealand. I want to play you just a little clip here when journalists were talking to him about what could possibly be the threat that would require domestic surveillance of New Zealand citizens. And this is his response. Check it out.
People have trained in New Zealand and gone off to those camps, and that's just the way things are. I mean, we live in a global environment where there are real threats, and that's the point we make with the GCSB legislation. That's why Helen Clark passed the legislation in 2003, that while it's very narrow and very small in number, the facts of life are that New Zealand is not immune from those potential risks.
So they're not. So Oliver, when you're balancing up potential risks and civil liberties, where do you fall?
Look, I mean, I'm practical about this. I think that we do need to have security and safeguards in place to make sure that, you know, that there are safeguards against domestic terrorism. But I think John Key is really engaging in a dangerous game right now in the media. And for the benefit of the international audience, this GCSB bill has been rushed through with minimal consultation, and critics like myself and like Dennis have been ridiculed. Now, I think one of the key problems is that the justification for the bill has not been provided. The Law Society in New Zealand, a very well-respected organisation of the country's lawyers and legal professionals, specifically noted over and over again throughout this entire process that there has not been justification provided as to this internal domestic terror threat. John Key has been talking to people, saying there are these people in New Zealand, these enemies within, and he's thrown around a few country names like Yemen, like Chechnya, but I think he's indulging in a bit of Islamophobia. I think he's just throwing in a few countries that sound a bit dangerous, but actually he hasn't provided any substantive evidence as to why the GCS bill, why the law needs to change. Then that's my real concern, is that this is just indulging in a game of race baiting and Islamophobia.
And Oliver, you're not the only one. On Facebook, Jaya says Prime Minister John Key's comments about the threat from terrorism are insulting to the intelligence of New Zealand citizens. But on the other hand, we have a Facebook comment from E. Tate who says, why spy on such a minuscule, uninvolved, globally sector of people? Now, Dennis, I want to direct that one to you because E. Tate goes on to say, I live in a country the size of the Australian continent, yet Australia only has a population of New York State. I'm sure you know how significant that is. I guess I'm skeptical unless there's something sinister brewing in New Zealand.
Well, governments always have a responsibility to protect their population from threats, however minor they may be. So there's no doubt that we do need GCSB legislation, and the government has a responsibility to make sure that New Zealanders are protected. But the point is that that is not to be at the expense of the freedom of information, freedom of speech, and the protection of privacy in this country, here in New Zealand. So there has to be a balance achieved there. And I don't think this bill really does achieve that balance adequately, because it gives away too much in terms of protection of privacy and the freedom of speech. It just goes a little bit too far in that direction. New Zealand First as a party here in New Zealand did want to engage with the government and did begin a conversation, but the government was so intent at rushing the legislation through that we did not get the opportunity that we really wanted to insert the changes that we would have liked to see in the bill to create more protection for New Zealanders' personal rights.
Okay, so let me just mention that we did contact the Prime Minister's office, and they actually gave us a statement for us to use on this programme, really about the transparency and why they feel that New Zealand citizens are actually still being protected regardless of this new law. So this is what the Office of the Prime Minister said. He said there are a lot of safeguards built into the legislative changes, including a stronger, better resourced and more proactive Inspector General of Intelligence and Security, an independent office which acts as a watchdog for the intelligence community. The legislation builds in more transparency around the intelligence agencies. That's quite a solid response to us, Jim. Does that make you feel very comfortable about what's about to happen in New Zealand?
Well, I think it's as I said before, it's actually regularised what has been practised in the last 10 years, I suppose.
Practice illegally.
And the...
That's, yeah.
Oh, well, it's... No, hang on, Dennis. It's not been illegal, and you know that it's not been illegal. It's been a grey area created by the 2000. Hang on. It's a grey area created by the 2003 Act that the Labor Party, the Labor government passed.
If it wasn't illegal, then why has it been so intent on changing the legislation? There have been.
I said it's a grey area.
Obvious that there has been illegal spying in New Zealand, and this legislation has been brought about to make it legal. That's the whole point of the thing.
For the benefit of the global audience out there, a report was released on the GCSB. There were a lot of accusations flying around last year, and a report was released earlier this year, which investigated how the GCSB operates, whether it had been breaking the law. Now, the report, which was a government report, said the GCSB may have broken the law at least 88 individuals. It may have broken the law. It may not have. But the key thing is that Jim's point, Jim is saying that they were breaking the law and let's just legalize it. My argument would be, if they're breaking the law, I want a thorough investigation into why the law was being broken and why this agency, this renegade intelligence agency, is just acting out of line and breaking the country's laws. And when they're caught, for some reason, we now retrospectively legalize that. I mean, what kind of country is New Zealand? I'm sure the global audience out there is looking at New Zealand thinking that we're a model democracy where we respect the rule of law, where we have a strong legal system. Yet cases like this, I think are internationally embarrassing. I think it's embarrassing we're even having this having to have a conversation about why a government is retrospectively legalizing a spying agency breaking the law. It strikes me like something out of a 1984 novel, or something out of a Minority Report.
Oliver, can you bear the embarrassment for the post-show? Because we're going to take this conversation and take it to stream.aljazeera.com, but it gives you an idea of where this conversation is going about domestic surveillance in New Zealand. So we have Jim, we have Dennis, we have Oliver. The conversation will continue, but first, here's Malika with some of the stories the stream is also following.
The results of Liberia's university admission exam are in, and they're easy to sum up. Everyone failed. First-year university classes are likely to be quiet next year as nearly 25,000 students were unable to pass the University of Liberia's entrance exam. While the school is considering remedial courses for those who nearly passed, Liberians online are asking how this could happen. Activist Kimmy Week started a lively debate on Facebook about the state of education in Liberia. Some pointed to corruption and bribery in the school system. Marcus writes, "This is a classic example of the obvious outcomes from a corrupt system." While Mimi on Facebook adds, "It's all due to poor high school foundations." Others, however, question the university's report. Thomas writes, "It is impossible and beyond human imagination that 25,000 students sit a test and then all fail." Well, staying in Africa for our next lead, Kenyans are tackling elephant poaching one tweet at a time. A campaign called Hands Off Our Elephants aims to combat the rising number of elephants killed for their tusks. An online petition calling for harsher punishments for poachers has reached more than 10,000 signatures. And a recent case against a Chinese ivory smuggler has Twitter users turning their attention to the demand from China. Porini Africa tweets, "The greatest favor the East can do Africa is banning rhino horn and ivory trade." Another image from the campaign asks what would happen if an African was found smuggling pandas from China. Well, from Liberia to Kenya to you, tell us what's happening in your country. Send suggestions via Facebook, Google+, or Twitter using hashtag AJStream. Femi?
Thanks so much, Malika. What are we going to be doing on the next show? Well, Indians are outraged at yet another gang rape in their country. On Wednesday, we'll take a look at the issue in a unique way, through the eyes of Indian men. What's behind the country's rape epidemic and how do they propose to stop it? The post show is next at stream.aljazeera.com. Thanks for watching. See you online. Hello again, this is the Stream's online post show. We're talking about a new law in New Zealand that allows the government to spy on its citizens. With us in Wellington, James Veach, an international security analyst. Via Skype in Auckland, Dennis O'Rourke, an MP with the New Zealand First Party. And via Skype in Kuala Lumpur, Oliver Woods, founder of the Cross the Floor campaign. Let's get right back to the conversation. Dotcom, do you remember him? He's an internet billionaire. He lives in New Zealand and he's very much involved in this whole story because he was spied on by the New Zealand government, and that started a whole furore which actually ended pretty much in this GCSB law. So, protests early on this year, back in July the 27th. This is what Dotcom had to say about the bill, which is now law. Have a listen to this.
This GCSB bill is a real threat. And it's not just a threat to us New Zealanders, because we are seeing a trend here. The US government is the most power-hungry government out there. What they are trying to do is to know everything about everyone and using that information to further their power, further their economic interests. And GCSB is one of the puppets on the strings of the US government. No one wants this bill. We are all against it because it makes no sense for us as a democracy to give these powerful tools to our governments.
So Jim, I want to bring Jim back in, but I also want to show you something, Jim, that was in the New Zealand Herald and show our audience as well. The New Zealand Herald, and the government was listening to various people about the GCSB bill before it became law. It describes you as the academic up against the heavies on the GCSB bill, and also intelligence studies lecturer, a lone voice in support of spy bill. Jim, what makes you such the lone voice? It's not a popular opinion that you're holding right now.
I didn't know I was a lone voice. I thought that I was just making a response to the bill at the time, based on what I know of the intelligence organisations in New Zealand. I've been lecturing about intelligence in New Zealand for some years, so I've accumulated quite a lot of knowledge of the intelligence organisations within New Zealand, the same as I know a fair bit about the Australian intelligence setup, and I know a lot about the US setup and British setup. So against all that background, I just made the response to the bill, and I thought that there were some very good things in the bill. Some things don't go far enough, and some things are a great deal further ahead than we've ever been in New Zealand before. And that's not to do with spying, that's to do with controlling the extent of the spying in New Zealand. I don't think anybody wants a police state, whatever. So there has to be good controls within the bill, and I think the bill actually puts in place some very good controls, which will be interesting to see how it's done in the next 2 or 3 years, because there's going to be a review in 2015.
Those controls are completely inadequate. So it's simply not true to say that there are good controls in the bill. It's just not true.
Dennis, they're better than they've ever been before. What are you talking about?
They may be better than they've been before, but the point is that it is completely wrong to tell people that there are good controls in the bill. There are controls in the bill, but they are completely inadequate. And that is exactly why we in New Zealand First wanted improvements. We wanted improvements so that ministers had constrained discretions and not unbridled discretions that they now have. We wanted a panel to exercise oversight which had real teeth, a panel which could cancel warrants, a panel which would review every warrant within 15 days, a panel of independent people and not people hand-picked by the Prime Minister. There are a lot of issues there, and it is completely wrong to say that the controls in the bill are adequate, because they simply are not.
Jim?
Well, they're adequate. They've gone a lot further than they've ever gone before. If there's a review in 2015,
they may have gone further than they've gone before, but they haven't gone far enough for today's world. And New Zealanders expect better oversight and more restriction on ministerial discretion than we are seeing in this legislation. And that is what most New Zealanders by far think about this. and they're most particularly concerned about the process by which the government has pushed this legislation through. Even those who support the legislation say, almost to a person, that they do not like the way that the government has pushed this through without adequate consultation and without adequate engagement of other parties.
Okay.
That's the truth of the matter.
Okay, let me just get the community back into the conversation.
Well, Dennis and Jim, there is someone who agrees with you, Jim, and I think would go against the newspaper article that you pulled up, Femi, that said that Jim is the lone voice. Have a listen to this video comment from a New Zealand resident.
I understand where the government and Prime Minister are coming from. While we do have a strong independent streak that we like, it's isolated us before. And if we want to pursue closer economic and political ties with the Anglosphere, it is important we need to make some kind of concessions. And if we don't take steps to monitor ourselves, it's likely that somebody else will. It's imperative to our economic and political security to have something like the GCSB bill in place. It's the reality of where information is being shared, and I think governments won't monitor that is naive.
So Jim, he seems to agree with you, but Oliver, I want to bring you in here on that. Is this a necessary concession that New Zealand has to make?
Look, I mean, I find the pragmatism, there's too much pragmatism in this. I mean, and look, I mean, James makes a lot of good points, and I think that he's obviously very knowledgeable about the subject. But I don't want New Zealand to sell our sovereignty and sell our civil liberties away just to get better relations with the United States and the UK. Look at the Edward Snowden and all the affairs around Bradley Manning. I certainly don't want New Zealand to be caught up in that sort of awful international spying, that sort of oppressive type of surveillance state, this kind of dystopian Blade Runner style future where we're kind of building up these huge databases to spy on citizens. Look, I work in technology and digital marketing, and I've seen just in private companies alone how much data private companies are amassing on people. And it really concerns me and troubles me that a country like New Zealand, which should be leading the world, I mean, we've led the world in so many areas. We were the first to legalize, to give marriage equality. We're one of the first countries in the Western world to legalize homosexuality. I think that we've still got, you know, we've in a way, we have like a reputation to defend, in a way, a progressive reputation. And my concern is that if we get involved and start seeing this as a quid pro quo with the United States, I certainly don't think New Zealand should be America's deputy sheriff in the South Pacific. That would really trouble me.
Jim, our audience might...
Do you think it is the... Oliver, do you really think New Zealand is the deputy sheriff in South Pacific? I think Australia has a greater claim to be that than New Zealand has. Well, I think Australia has much better, it has more money to put into it. Australia is far more ahead of New Zealand in this whole area than we realise. I think New Zealand's a very, very small player and is not involved in the collection of data to the extent that America is concerned with the collection of data amongst its own citizens. New Zealand's nowhere near that, nor is it nowhere near where Australia is at. I think we exaggerate what's been happening in New Zealand and what the potential for things to happen in New Zealand is. I think we are very strongly in New Zealand, New Zealanders are very strong about our independence and our privacy and so on, and that is a very important counter to the kind of things that we've been talking about today that other countries have gone a lot further in spying on their own citizens with.
Dennis.
Jim, you're making a lot of assumptions about this. The truth is that none of us really know the extent to which the New Zealand government allows the collection of information on behalf of the United States and other countries in New Zealand. And bases like Waihopai clearly exist not really for the benefit of New Zealand and our requirements. It exists more for the other partners which we have in the Five Eyes Agreement. So it's not really true to say that we're not a big player. We may not be a major player, but we certainly play a part in New Zealand in terms of the collection of information for the benefit of the other four members of the Five Eyes partnership.
So we're right at the end of our show.
True.
We've been speaking for 40 minutes, everybody. Can you believe that? Jim and Dennis and Oliver, the conversation has run away with us. There is one thing, though, I do want to ask Jim. Jim started the very first intelligence studies course in New Zealand. He knows things that the rest of us are never, ever going to know. So when we're talking about domestic surveillance on New Zealand citizens, You've got your warrant, you've got your permission now that the law is in place. How are they going to do it, Jim? How do they check up on us?
Well, you have to remember that the New Zealand Police is the agency that authorises the collection of the data that the GCSB will contribute to. It's really the New Zealand Police that make these decisions. It's not these organisations that make decisions in their own right. Everything is funneled through the New Zealand Police, and there are very good controls further up too, because the Office of Prime Minister and Cabinet in New Zealand has a special committee that sets the
Jim,
standards
how are they going
collection
to do it,
and so on.
That's the actual spying. How do they do it?
Well, they do it the same as they do it in any other country. There's a filter, and the filter weeds out what you don't want and identifies what you do want. That's the way it's worked in every country in the world.
Okay, New Zealand, join the club. Thank you very much to Jim, to Dennis, to Oliver. Closing thought from our online community is what?
Well, Jim
Monica?
said the spying happens as it does anywhere around the world. We got a Facebook comment from Hannah. We pretty much said the same thing. All governments spy on each other and their own people. Since before the internet or even telephones, there's nothing new about this.
Thank you very much, community. Always wise, always good with the last comment there. What are we going to be doing on our next show? Well, Indians are outraged at yet another gang rape in their country. On Wednesday, we'll take a look at the issue in a unique way, through the eyes of Indian men. What's behind the country's rape epidemic, and how do they propose to stop it? It promises to be a fascinating conversation and a helpful one, hopefully. In the meantime, we will be online at stream.aljazeera.com. Thanks for watching. Take care.